Hey everyone! Today we're going to talk about ancient Egypt, and specifically ancient Egypt as ruled by the pharaohs. So here is a map of ancient Egypt. And for the beginning of ancient Egyptian history and sort of throughout it, there were lots of conflicts. Ancient Egypt was divided into Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, two separate kingdoms. Confusingly, Lower Egypt is geographically higher on the map, but Lower Egypt is the area where the delta is, which is how you can remember it. Now, ancient Egypt was ruled by pharaohs, and pharaoh is the ancient Egyptian term for a ruler that was believed to be semi-divine. So the pharaoh was essentially a king, but the people that were ruled by the pharaoh believed him to be part god. You'll see in depictions of the pharaoh that he is almost always wearing a crown. Sometimes it looks kind of like a bowling pin or like a cobra's head, and sometimes it is depicted with both aspects. This is the crown of Upper versus Lower Egypt and the crown of the United Kingdoms. Papyrus is an important vocab term for this section because the papyrus plant, as pictured back here, grew abundantly in ancient Egypt and still does grow in Egypt and Africa today, and was used to create a very durable form of paper. The reeds of the papyrus plant were pounded with a hammer, one on top of the other, layered like this, and then set out to dry. And very detailed written records would be taken on these papyrus scrolls and then rolled up. And all records were written in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Here is an example of hieroglyphic writing. I'm sure you've seen it before somewhere. Although it appears to be made up of symbols that you might associate with certain things, so here, for example, is a bird and what looks like a spoon and a flag, these don't actually stand for the objects that they represent. They all make up part of an alphabet, just like ours. So in our alphabet, the letter A makes the sound A. In ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, each one of these images would make a certain sound. Archaeologists have been able to decipher the hieroglyphs and read them, and from them we get a very detailed view of what ancient Egyptian life was like. We're going to begin by looking at an object called the Palette of Narmer, which visually might seem a little underwhelming to you, but I can't emphasize its importance. This object is seen as being so important that it's actually never left Egypt, because archaeologists there don't want it to leave the country. Why is it so important? Well, it's important because it sets up the standard, the blueprint, essentially, of Egyptian art for nearly 3,000 years after it. Here is an image from the Palette of Narmer, and here is an image of the pharaoh Ramses III, made almost 3,000 years later, and you'll see that it's so very similar. It's essentially unchanged. Here is the palette itself. This shape here is the shape of a palette that was used for eye makeup, and ancient Egyptians typically wore very heavy eyeshadow because it protected their eyes against the bright desert sun. So palettes were small, and the eyeshadow was mixed in a little hole like this in the center of the palette, and then it was applied. This, though, was never used for the creation of eyeshadow. This is just a ritual object, and it's very large, much larger than a palette would have actually been, kind of the size of a shield. And on it, it displays the Pharaoh Narmer. Here he is. You can tell it's him because he's big, right? The hierarchy of scale. And he united both Upper and Lower Egypt. This here tells the story of the kingdoms being united. You can see him on one side wearing the crown of Lower Egypt, and here wearing the crown of Upper Egypt. But this here shows how he combined the two. Some details of the palette here deciphered. So we've got this image of him in what's called a smiting pose, and to smite just means to kill. So here he is smiting one of his enemies, and this is a pose that's going to be used for centuries afterwards. You can see that everything is very flat and depicted from the side. It's very stylized. That's not to say that ancient Egyptian artists weren't able to depict things quote-unquote realistically, but they chose to use this style so that all of the images could be read very clearly, and there's a certain amount of strength and severity that's conveyed with this very stylized style. Here we have a foe, so maybe it says something about who he is, maybe he was a particularly important foe, and we have all of these images of the dead and images of gods and an attendant. Everything emphasizes the pharaoh's power, and indeed most Egyptian art that we look at does emphasize the power of the pharaoh and backed up with the gods themselves. Let's talk a little bit about ancient Egyptian architecture. So I'm sure you're familiar with the pyramids of ancient Egypt, but they weren't built overnight, and the precursor to the pyramid is called the mastaba. Mastaba is an Arabic word, it means bench, and the mastabas were built out of brick, and they were used as tombs. They were supposed to be monumental forms over the tombs to commemorate the dead pharaohs. This here was constructed by Imhotep. Imhotep is the first architect whose name we have recorded. Does this remind you of anything that we've looked at before? I'm asking this because I want you to remind you of the ziggurat. It's a very similar form. Certainly there was a lot of cultural interchange. This shape here led to the pyramids, which we're going to look at in a second. But why would the ancient Egyptians want to construct such elaborate funerary architectural forms? It's because of their religion. They believed in a very detailed afterlife that was populated by the gods, and the ancient Egyptians believed in many, many gods. Most of these gods were anthropomorphic, meaning they had both human and animal characteristics, and they were all divine. It was believed that once you died, you would encounter them in the afterlife, and you would either go on to live with them in paradise forever, or be cast into the ancient Egyptian form of hell. And so it was very important that you had everything that you would need in the afterlife buried with you so that you could take it with you when you died. And your body had to be preserved, mummified, so that you would be able to travel into the next world. Therefore, when the pharaohs died, they were given the most elaborate burials of all, and their burial chambers were enclosed in as elaborate a form as possible. So the Great Pyramids were actually built as tombs for pharaohs, and inside of them, the pharaohs were buried with all kinds of really wonderful treasure. But because the pyramids are so gaudy and ostentatious, of course, they've been robbed a very, very long time ago, so most of the treasure and the mummies, everything was removed from them. There are only very few things left inside, and most of what was actually buried there has been lost. It's all speculative. The Great Pyramids, there's 3 of them that are the most notable, were each built for pharaohs. On this map you can see who was where. We've got Menkaure is the smallest, Khafre, and Khufu. The Great Sphinx was associated with the Pyramid of Khafre. You can see a little road connected the 2 of them. And surrounding the Great Pyramids there are many other burials of royalty and of the pharaoh's many wives. When they were first built, the sides of the pyramids were bright and shiny, and they reflected the sun. The very top of the pyramid was covered with gold, so everything would have glittered. How were the pyramids built? I know a lot of you out there are going to want to say aliens. Maybe. I don't know. I've never seen an alien, but I have seen all of the charts that archaeologists have made up showing how many slaves it would have taken to construct these using a system of ramps, and it seems like that's the most likely explanation for how they were built. I have this little statistic here explaining how big they are. I've also read that if you were to take all of the stones from the 3 pyramids and lay them around the country of France, you'd be able to create a continuous wall. Just to drive home how large these are, this here is the entrance to a burial shaft in the Pyramid of Khafre, and this here was a boat that was inside of the pyramid that was included as part of his burial, because he would want that later in the afterlife. Okay, which 3 pharaohs built the Great Pyramids? I'm going to give you a second to answer that. If you said Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, you're right. Most of the pharaohs throughout ancient Egyptian history were men. There are a couple of notable exceptions, and the most successful female pharaoh is named Hatshepsut. Here we have an image of her, and what's kind of interesting is that she appears to be anatomically male. And indeed, in her depictions, she chose to be shown as anatomically male because she knew her subjects were used to male rulers and would therefore respect her more if she was shown as a man. And since most of her subjects would never have seen her in real life, they would only see her images, and she would want to appear as powerful as possible to them. She ruled Egypt successfully for over 20 years, and under her rule, Egypt prospered. But following her death, her son, who was embittered and believed that he should have ruled while she was ruler, had most of her images destroyed, which is why this one is pieced together. Hatshepsut had a very beautiful tomb built for her, which is pictured here on the upper left, and the way that it's nestled into the existing rock formations makes it seem even larger than it actually is. I encourage you to look into her history further. She's fascinating. But we have to move right along. Let's talk about the pharaoh Akhenaten. Akhenaten is a pharaoh who changed Egyptian culture, politics, and religious life dramatically. And the period in which he ruled is referred to as the Amarna period, because he changed the location of the capital city to the city of Amarna. It had been in Thebes. So let's look at some of the artwork and discuss some of the changes that he undertook. We're going to begin by looking at this image of his mother. It should be dramatically different than what you usually associate with ancient Egyptian art, correct? It's very expressive, it's very emotional. You get a real sense of who this woman might have been, and dare I say, she doesn't seem like she would have been terribly pleasant. You get a sense of her skin tone, the texture of her hair. It seems like this was a depiction of a real person, not just a formula. We see this shift take place during this time period. Now, what brought it about? Why do we see such a dramatic shift in art? Here we have 3 rulers, and this is the succession. So Amenhotep II was first. He's on the far left here. Then Amenhotep III, and then Akhenaten on the far right. Now, Akhenaten was born with the name Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep means worshipper of Amen, and Amen was one of the Egyptian gods. Now, the priests of Amen during this time period had gained a lot of power, and they essentially ruled Egypt and used the pharaohs only as a figurehead. So when Akhenaten was born, he was born Amenhotep IV, but when he came to power, he turned his name into Akhenaten, which means worshipper of Aten. And when he was in power, we can see that he enforced a different type of artwork. Why would he have wanted to do this? It was because he was trying to change everything about Egyptian culture. Egyptian culture was typically polytheistic, which means they worshipped multiple gods, including the god Aten. Now, what Akhenaten did was he made Aten the principal god. This isn't to say that he told everyone that Aten was the only god, because worshipping only one god would be referred to as monotheism, and religions such as Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are monotheistic. But what Akhenaten was actually practicing was henotheism, meaning that he chose only to worship one god, the god Aten, and he told everyone to do the same. Although he still did accept the existence of other gods, he just argued that they were less important. He wanted to change the culture and the religion, so therefore he had art changed during his rule, and he saw to it that all depictions of him were dramatically different than depictions of pharaohs we've seen in the past. Here is a portrait of Akhenaten. You can see that his features are greatly exaggerated, and his body seems to combine both male and female characteristics, since a combination of the female and the male in a single body was seen as divine. He wanted everybody who saw this to notice that there was a drastic change in art, which was accompanied by the drastic change in culture. This bust here of Nefertiti was also created during this time, and you can see that it shows a kind of casual liveliness and an informality and a real sense of the actual person that's almost unseen in other examples of ancient Egyptian art. It's carved of limestone and was brightly painted, and this bust was found by a German archaeologist, this guy here, Ludwig Borchardt. He uncovered most of the artwork of the Amarna period and took it immediately back to Berlin from Egypt. This is still contested today. Egyptians claim it as a theft, and I would argue that yes, he absolutely did steal the artwork. I encourage you to look into the history, it's fascinating. I snuck in 2 pop culture references just to show the enduring power of this artwork. We have Tupac, a famous rapper, and Rihanna, a pop singer, both decided to get tattoos of Nefertiti. And then finally, let's talk about King Tut. So, Akhenaten, the pharaoh, he died, and he was followed by the pharaoh Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun is often called the boy king because he came to power at a very early age and was obviously a figurehead, didn't make any political decisions himself. Under his quote-unquote rule, the priests of Amun regained their previous political power and tried to bring ancient Egypt back to exactly the way it was before Akhenaten had ruled. King Tut, however, died at an early age. He died at 18, and when he died, he was given what is considered to be a sort of very traditional ancient Egyptian burial. His tomb is one of the few tombs that was uncovered untouched by archaeologists in the present day. So here is an illustration of what his tomb looked like, and here is his innermost coffin, which was found in the tomb. And you can see it's very lavish, it's pure gold, and there were various treasures buried with him. This was a very typical ancient Egyptian burial. This is an image you'll see reproduced often because it's the death mask of Tutankhamun. It's made of solid gold with inlay and semi-precious stones. It would have been placed directly over his mummy, and archaeologists were able to take his mummy and make an accurate rendering of what Tutankhamun would have looked like in real life. Here he is. He had a club foot. The way he's died is still contested. Did he die during a fight? Did he die of a fever? I encourage you to look into that as well. You can see that his death mask is considerably flattering, and it also combines all of the classical tropes of ancient Egyptian art. So it's very stylized. It speaks of power and wealth and strength, which is exactly what they wanted. And it's a real step away from the shift towards the more casual and realistic that we saw under Akhenaten. There's a lot more that we could study, but I'm going to end this here in the interest of time, and I encourage you to look into all of these topics more.